All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. This is a special bonus episode, a little bit more of a freewheeling version of Clayton and Megan. This is sort of what you're going to get if you subscribe to our platform, our podcast on the various platforms that it exists on. We are trying to find a way to make sure that this podcast is not a money sink for us, quite frankly.
Trying to make back the cost of the equipment, really.
Yes,
we're not
basically trying to make back
our job.
The cost of the equipment, the cost of the podcast recording platform that we're using for the first time right now, as our previous setup was kind of shitty. Quite frankly,
a little haphazard.
A little bit of more work than we wanted to go for. But yeah, so. But we wanted to ask sort of at the top here, what works best for you, the listeners? There are multiple different options of how to do this kind of thing. As I was talking to Megan before we began recording, maybe this is a generational thing, but I have never once, subscribed to a podcast directly on the podcast service, but I have supported several Patreons.
And I am the reverse.
The other way around. Megan was like, why would anyone ever want to go to a whole separate platform like Patreon to subscribe to something? But anyway, long story short, we want to hear from you what works best for you. We will be setting up subscription platform stuff for Spotify and Apple by the time that this episode comes out. But if you would prefer something like a Patreon or some other platform, please let us know. You can reach us either in the comments on whatever podcasting platform you are listening to us on, or we also have an email address at rejectmodernitypod@gmail.com. All one word, no underscores or anything, just rejectmodernitypod@gmail.com. You can reach us there. If you have comments about the show, questions, things for future episodes, any of the above, really. But with that in mind, let's actually get into the content for today. We are rejecting trunk or treat, embracing trick or treat. This is our special Halloween bonus episode.
Very seasonal. For those of you who are watching on a visual medium, I have my pumpkin earrings on for the occasion.
She had a witch's hat earlier, but
we decided it was too much.
We decided it was a little too far without me wearing a costume. But anyway, yes. So, Megan, for those who aren't aware of the abomination that is trunk or treat, what is trunk or treat?
Yes, so trunk or treat, we are kind of limiting ourselves to a institution or a situation where a group of families come together in a central location, often a church or school parking lot, and the children in costume go from car to car saying trick or treat and getting candy, as you would traditionally going house to house for trick or treating that we all may be a little bit more familiar with. In some places, the grown-ups decorate the cars and try to make it seem a little more authentic, but it is fundamentally an artificially constructed Halloween experience for children.
Yeah, it's basically you go around in a big loop of cars in a parking lot. And it's no fun, and it's horrible, and this is why we are making this Halloween episode about it. Give a little bit of the historical background on trunk or treat. It really started out, at least the first mentions of it are in the 90s. And it largely comes out of the sort of stranger danger, my kids are going to be abducted while they're doing their Halloween trick or treating. As a safer alternative among religious groups to substitute for Halloween night trick-or-treating.
And this is a big church is really involved in this, which is a very interesting kind of overlap. And I wonder how much of that is, trying to inject religiosity into a holiday that can be called in some denominations satanic. Clayton, I was going to ask you, your mom's a pastor, but I do assume you were allowed to do Halloween?
Yes, my mom's denomination is one of the more progressive denominations in the country.
I kind of figured the denominations that have women pastors and the denominations that think Halloween is satanic. Two separate circles.
Yes. So there's two separate things that I want to talk about here with regards to the religious organization. So first, yes, it does come out of this sort of Halloween is satanic, like the satanic panic sort of stuff of like the 70s and 80s, right? 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's a reaction to that sort of long-term secularization of like the All Hallows Eve into Halloween, right? The second thing is that
I gotta say, this is a Protestant thing, you know.
It is a Protestant thing,
by virtue of coming early, really understood that they got to keep all the fun stuff.
Yeah. You have to attract people in from the paganism, right? Whereas the whole ethos of Protestantism is that everything should be boring, right?
Yeah.
Like, you go to the very earliest like Protestant churches in like the northeastern United States, very austere, extremely boring. They were called the Puritans for a reason, people, right?
You know, not unlike their doctrine, very bleak all the way down.
They were reacting against what they saw as the opulence of the Catholic Church, right? But anyway, sorry to bring us back again. More freewheel in here. You guys are getting the uncensored version of the podcast, the unplanned version of the podcast.
A bit spicier generally. I think we're going to get the hotter takes on the subscription feed, because if I'm going to argue with you about my hottest of takes, I want to know you've paid for the privilege.
Something is playing. There we go. Sorry.
You're horrified by the suggestion that people should pay to argue with us.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear anything you were saying. My headphones connected to my telephone and started playing the Men in Blazers podcast. Just like at random. Anyway, Megan, what were you just saying? We're not going to re-record this. It's staying in. We're doing it live.
Oh my god, doing it live. Oh my god. No, so I was saying, you know, we're getting into some spicier takes about like what is the best Christian denomination, I think as a teaser for what is going on the bonus feed, the subscriber feed, as opposed to the main feed, the spicier takes, the more controversial ones might be going there. Just because if you're going to email to complain about my spiciest of takes, I do want to know that you've paid.
Yeah,
100%. To do that.
There was a point earlier in the planning for this podcast where we were going to do an episode called "Reject Christianity, Embrace Christianity."
Bonus feed.
Bonus feed. Got to go in the bonus content. Okay, but to bring it back around.
Yes, to Trunk or Treat.
Trunk or Treat. The second thing about Trunk or Treat that like has its sort of origins here already questionable is that it's an inherently exclusionary enterprise. Yes. Trunk or treats are like invite only practically, right? You have to be a part of the community. Like you have to know about it. You have to be a part of the group putting it on, right? And like if you just show up, right, like the day of the trunk or treat, people are going to look at you like you've got mushrooms growing out of your ears, right? Like it is an exclusionary way.
In some communities, I did just drive by. I was in my parents' small town over the weekend, and they have the Methodist Church has its little like change letter sign that says this is when our trunk or treat is. Come join us. So
I suppose to clarify, this is like the origins of the phenomenon.
Oh, okay, gotcha,
right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
When churches were doing this for the very first time in the 90s, it was like this is for the members of the church, right? And in many places still, these trunk or treats will be done in a way that is like only for people who are living in a certain neighborhood or only people who are living in a certain like subdivision or something like that, right? A gated community. And so we've moved from the sort of like, and this is what Megan wants to put on a sticker, is we've moved from the Halloween is satanic line to the Halloween is socialism line. Yes. And we can't have kids from outside our neighborhood, right, doing trick-or-treating at our nice houses. Like,
yes, it is our own little tired wired. Yeah.
The kids, tired, Halloween is satanic. Wired, Halloween is socialism.
Yes.
We will produce these stickers if enough people want them. I don't know how we'll do it, but we'll do it.
We'll figure it out.
But so this is the origin of the phenomenon, basically. This is the origin of trunk or treat. And it has grown into this thing, this like no longer like thing that's an addition to the traditional Halloween trick-or-treating.
No, instead
of a full substitute for it, right? Like it's not something that churches do a couple of weeks earlier for their members so that the kids in the congregation can still have a Halloween experience, even if their parents aren't going to let them go trick-or-treating the actual night of because they're scared of all the sort of stranger danger stuff, the like razor blades and candy and all of that like have been totally debunked, right?
We can definitely talk about that. I have stats. I did prep for this, Clayton.
We'll do that in just a moment then. But it's moved from being that, right? It's moved from being a situation where you are adding this on to the Halloween festivities to it being a total substitute for everyone's Halloween festivities. Yep. And it's just totally unnecessary, right? And it really is like,
it sucks.
It's completely and totally ruining Halloween for everyone. This is our considered opinion. So Megan, take it away. What are these statistics about why this is like just totally not required?
So among other things, you're talking about this starts in the 90s as an exclusionary technique. I also want to say something that happens at about the same time. I went and I looked this up. Sex offender registries start in the mid to late 90s. It's this sort of panic about harm coming to children in your community. And that risk, that idea that your children are going to be harmed, be it in terms of a sexual assault kind of way, a trigger warning, or in just an abduction, a kidnapping kind of way, we're seeing a lot of that concern. And again, as we've discussed, people are very bad at assessing risk, and especially bad at assessing this type of risk. So you've got
I assume that part of this is that these statistics are now produced, and so people think,
oh, we can know what they are as opposed to before we didn't necessarily know. I know, I have a friend who he moved houses, and the first thing he did was check the public sex offender database, which became public in 2006. Which, the internet can be used for many good things, but it's also used for this. So that expectation and that kind of knowledge, like you just wouldn't have known before. And it doesn't make people necessarily feel safer to know. In some ways, maybe they would have assumed that they didn't have a sex offender in their neighborhood before, and now they know. There's also the initial over-inclusion in those lists. When the laws first come into effect about sex offender registries, they catch a lot of people who are engaged in behavior that while not, necessarily great, is not the sort of behavior that is going to compel them to go and seek out other victims. Now we see in a lot of states having Romeo and Juliet exceptions for sex offender registries. That's if one party was below the age of consent, but the other party was just a couple years older. And those exceptions don't necessarily exist in every state at the advent of these lists. So people are more aware of the possible threat around them. However, they're discounting where that threat really does come from. This is when we get the, as you mentioned, I think, stranger danger idea. 99% of abducted children are abducted by relatives, usually a non-custodial father. Most missing children are runaways, and only 10% of child victimizations in violent crimes are by complete strangers. So the kind of creepy house at the edge of the neighborhood, that's not the person you should be worried about when you are worried about your children. And so Trunk or Treat.
Home Alone tried to teach us this,
right? The creepy guy
is
creepy
actually
guy
at the end of the street is actually
yeah.
very nice. Yeah, 100%.
And so what's interesting about this is, in doing my research, I actually found an article from 2005 about how stranger danger is absolutely the wrong way to teach our kids about how to assess risk. And in discussing in our helicopter parenting episode, we talked about kind of building skills in children to do risky things safely. Teaching children how to look at a house or look at the people who come to the door and go like, hey, thanks, later, and getting yourself out of that situation is probably a good skill to have. But all of this is really a result, in addition to having these statistics available, of decline in trust. So we're turning to this pre-vetted, you have come to this place in this church parking lot to do this thing specifically because we don't trust everyone around us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're losing the ability to develop that trust if we reject trick or treat in the kind of neighborhood inclusive form.
And also, this is just sort of the longer term trend. And you guys will hear this in the helicopter parenting episode, which we've already recorded, but which is not out yet.
It's not out yet? Okay.
Will not be out by the time that this goes live.
All right.
The recording and release schedule, we'll get better at this as we go on.
Yeah.
But yeah, like to Megan's point, right? Like there's this longer term trend towards infantilizing children of all ages, right?
Mhm.
And a big part of this is thinking that they cannot handle doing trick or treat on their own, right? Like they can't, even under the supervision of another parent, right? Like
I never
under the
went
supervision
trick or treating by myself, but the parents were like at the end of the block.
Yeah, like under the supervision of either their parent specifically or another parent who's like part of the extended friend parent group, right? Like the idea that children like lack the ability to go up to a door and like ask for candy, right? Like while you are standing at the end of the walkway, right? Like it's a complete infantilization of children and like their ability to do anything for themselves, right?
Yeah, well, and then skills. I think really quickly, like there's not a huge difference between teaching a child to go up to a door, knock on the door, say trick or treat, say thank you, and then leave. It's a surprisingly short step from that to emailing your professor to ask for an extension on a paper, you know?
Yeah. Or just to like talk to people at a party that you don't know, right? Like basic socialization, right? Yeah. And then absolutely. Yes. Like 100%, right? Like, I'm sorry. I'm just like, I'm a little bit annoyed by this fact that we are treating children as though they are like not people and like they're just something else entirely, and we've just like sort of decided to do this, right? On top of that, we've decided to do this thing where like we're not going to trust children to be able to make their own decisions or to like do things even supervised on their own. But we've also reached this point within ourselves. We've reached this like point as a society where older children are inherently untrustworthy. And so they must be banned from doing anything on their own. And this is another part of the whole like broader societal implications here of not just not just rejecting trunk or treat, but really embracing trick or treat. Is there are hundreds of municipalities around the country that just fully ban children older than 12 from trick-or-treating. Like it is a misdemeanor crime and you can be fined a couple of $100s if you are a teenager who goes trick-or-treating. Even just a decade ago, when I was a teenager and wanted to go trick-or-treating in my freshman year of high school, because I feel like that's still a reasonable age to like want to do that and have fun, like with a group of friends from high school. Like it was the last year I did it, but there was absolutely like no prohibition against it whatsoever. And so this change has happened very rapidly just in the last decade. That we've decided that teenagers cannot be allowed to be teenagers.
So specifically to this, I feel like social media has played a role in this because my last year trick-or-treating, I was actually 16 and I did not collect candy. I reminded people to turn in their ballots because I'm a nerd. And
you couldn't get that information out of me, Megan. I would not admit to being that much of a nerd.
Oh no, I started young. And of course, and I have a younger brother. So there's a role for me in being out there walking my brother and his friends around. They would have been 12. If I'm out there kind of supervising my brother and his friends, that makes sense. And if an adult wants to give me candy, I'm not mad. So there's that sort of, that novelty to that, I think, has to do with social media. You see either through Facebook or things like Nextdoor. There's a certain thing where like,
don't even get me started on Nextdoor. Yeah.
The worst opinion rises to the top.
Yeah, man. Like just the absolute worst kind of busybodies with absolutely nothing to do.
Yeah.
Spend all their time. Like there's whole Twitter accounts that are dedicated to like insane Nextdoor posts.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you here. Yeah, I think like it's similar to how the Stranger Danger stuff began to be published in the 90s and early 2000s. Now you're seeing that teenagers sometimes get up to being teenagers, and you're like, oh no, we can't allow that. Like nothing bad is ever allowed to happen in my suburban town.
And if nothing else, this is going to be a weird reference, but have you ever seen the movie Meet Me in St. Louis? Got Judy Garland in it.
I have not seen this movie.
It's an old movie. It's from like 1944 or something. But
so
it's
even before your time, Megan.
It is before my time. It is before my time. But it's supposed to take place around the St. Louis World's Fair. So it's like 1903, 1904.
Oh, yeah, like very, very early. Yeah, early 20th century.
Movie are taking place, and the kids are running around, and it doesn't appear that they're taking candy. It appears that the children are throwing flour in people's faces. So like the idea that the trick was a real threat, like, and now it's just, oh, we have teenagers out running around. Like, no, you're lucky if they don't egg your house, man. Like, what are we doing here? So it's become weirdly sanitized.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just odd. Is it just the Karenification or something?
I think that is I would say an accurate description of this,
okay,
right? It's yeah.
Someone is going to complain, and it's chilling the behavior of everyone.
Yes, absolutely, right? Like we are a nation that has, over the last 30 to 40 years or so, become totally addicted to the heckler's veto.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about this much more at length in real episodes.
Yes.
But this is one manifestation of that heckler's veto, right? Some group of 13-year-olds is going to TP someone's house. It's gonna suck for the person who lives there. And so every teenager in the town must be prohibited from going out after 10 p.m. or something like that. That was an ordinance that did exist when I was a teenager. Like,
oh my gosh.
Teenagers were not allowed to be...
midnight. We had a midnight
teenagers
curfew.
were not allowed to be out in my town after, I think it was like 10:30 p.m. or something like that. Like, this was an official town ordinance that there was a curfew for people under the age of 18.
What time did your football games end? Like, that doesn't...
Earlier than that, for sure. Our football games on Friday were usually over by... I was in the marching band, so I remember this well. They were almost always over by like 9:30.
Okay. Probably because you all have to go home and make sure you don't get in trouble.
Right?
Did you live in the town from Footloose? Like, what is happening here?
No, I feel like I lived in a very normal suburb, right? Like,
yeah, aside
I feel
from
like
this.
No, I think this is a normal thing that exists in lots of places. Right?
Okay.
Like, lots of towns nowadays have these curfews on teenagers. And it's just, it's so puritanical and so annoying and like so paternalistic. Anyway, long story short, I don't like it. I think this is a particular manifestation of it.
Yeah. Something else I want to throw in here before I don't know how long we're gonna go on this episode, because again, we're just winging it right now.
Bonus content.
Bonus. So like, trick or treat is really good for adults.
Yeah, right.
Let me say this. Yeah. Let me say, because this is trick or treat is an opportunity, if you have not had it yet, to get to know your neighbors. This is how I met most of the people I lived around when I lived in a small town outside of Portland. It was trick or treat. The neighbors come up and say, "Hey, we actually live behind you guys. We haven't met you yet. This is our kid. You know, blah blah." That's important for a number of reasons. Among other things, what if I find this toddler just out wandering? I'd like to know where he lives. But it also builds that trust. This is the same principle. Are you familiar with like National Night Out?
Yes,
which is sponsored by actually law enforcement. I don't know, like Neighborhood Watch has gotten a terrible rap over the last 20 years because it's a bunch of usually men who think that they should be cops but don't actually know how to do it, and they make bad choices. Get off my lawn types. Yes. I mean, if you're lucky, like the Neighborhood Watch folks who killed people, you know, and what law enforcement is doing with that National Night Out thing is block parties so you get to know your neighbors and build the trust. I don't know that they know that they're doing this, but that is what is happening. The same thing happens with trick-or-treating. You are out as an adult with kids who are out trick-or-treating. You are meeting the other adults and you are getting to know who belongs in your community, which is really good. And when I say that, it sounds like I'm being exclusionary. I'm not. It's important to know who belongs in your community, so you're not
or
like
just like
calling the
who
cops
is
on someone
where, right?
Who is where? Yeah, you know your neighbor across the street. You haven't met them before. You see somebody climbing in the front window of the house. You go, oh my god! But it's actually your neighbor who forgot their keys. You don't want to call the cops on your neighbor who forgot their keys.
And
so
like
it's good to know who lives in your neighborhood.
Yeah, and we've got tons of stories of this happening, right? Like the people who, like a decade ago or whatever, the people who called the cops on Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates,
yes,
like who had forgotten his keys, right?
Yes, that is exactly true.
And it's also just like there's a broader point here, like that knowing who is in your neighborhood, who quote unquote belongs to your neighborhood, having that community trust is extremely important to like keeping your community safe just in general, right? Not necessarily from criminals, right?
No.
Like, that as well, but also just like knowing that like, oh, like so and so is home, right? Most of the time,
so and so isn't, you know.
Yeah, right. Like so and so's home most of this time. Like if my kids come home at age 12 from middle school, like I know there's an adult across the street, right?
Yes.
Like that kind of thing. This is what Jane Jacobs talks about in The Death and Life of Great American Cities as eyes on the street, right? Like knowing that there are people in your community who you don't necessarily have an intimate, close relationship with, but have that like passing familiarity, right? Understanding that like they exist in the same public realm as you do, right? And this helps to keep a sort of monitoring watch on the community as a whole. Yes. And so you can rely on Mrs. Jacobs across the street to let you know that your kids got home safely. Because your kids are like 12 and even if they have a phone, they don't remember to text you to let them know, let you know that they got home, right?
Like, just as another example, over the summer my neighbor's car got stolen. Immediately 3 different people had called the police. And she came over. She felt comfortable coming next door to my parents and I and asking for our help. My mother let her, just because her phone was in the car that got stolen, my mom gave her cell phone and said, go call people. You need this more than I do. They had, the number of people who jumped in who don't like really know each other, but know each other well enough to fill in that community gap in that moment. That's the benefit of having a community where you know your neighbors. And why this relates to trick-or-treating is it is just one more opportunity to build that sense of connection.
Yeah, it's one more manifestation of this like social atomization that we've been experiencing in this country, right? And the kinds of things that we need to embrace in order to get ourselves out of these silos that we've put ourselves in.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I think we're coming up on the time that I want to spend on bonus content here. I think people aren't going to want to listen for much longer anyway.
Yeah, we're not going to listen to SBS for that much longer.
But I do think we should take just one tack on the flip side here of one of the actual dangers of trick-or-treating and a way that we do need to like address this concern more broadly.
Yeah,
which is that Halloween is far and away the deadliest day of the year for pedestrians, right? And it is because drivers cannot fucking be bothered to understand that this is one night of the year where the streets belong to people rather than cars.
Yep.
Right? And we're going to talk about this at length in future episodes on like urbanism and car dependency and all of this. But I think it's important to acknowledge that like this is perhaps the one justified fear of taking your kids out for trick-or-treating, right?
I think this is what really drove my Halloween experience as a kid, and I'm sure I'll talk about this. I will be talking about this on the helicopter parenting episode. I lived in on a very, very busy street. It was a country road. I think the speed limit was 55, and there were no sidewalks. So what my parents would do was drive my brother and I to the first like planned development in our community that had sidewalks, and we would trick or treat there with my brother's friends. That was what we would do, just because it was not physically safe to trick or treat in the neighborhood right around our house, which makes sense. That's a completely justified concern for parents.
And so I think that this is part of, broadly speaking, embracing trick-or-treat even more so, right? Like there are these times, there are these days, there are instances where we really should give over control of streets to people rather than cars, right?
Yes.
I think we should do this a lot more often than we do. I think we should have like more days where you shut down stretches of road and there are like markets that get put up there. There's like block parties and things like that. Like when I was in New York, they shut down a section of Broadway a couple of times a year and had like street markets that were on that stretch of Broadway. You could just walk straight onto the main road, right? Like this idea that we have sort of decided that cars are able to take up and justified in taking up as much space as they want at any given time. Like everything is for the ease and like the comfort of people in vehicles and for commuters. Like that needs to stop, right?
Yeah.
And we'll talk more about this
after dark one night a year.
Yeah, right? Like there are be as much of an asshole as you want, right? Like on any other day of the year, or I don't know, some other days of the year, we can have the streets be for us as well. But this is like the one day of the year when you know there are going to be large numbers of people walking outside in the street at night after dark. Like, shut the fuck up. Like, suck it up, Buttercup, and let people have this street for the one night a year. You know what I mean? So yeah, we'll talk more in depth about this and sort of like all of why car dependency is bad and everything in a future real episode, quote unquote real episode. But I do think this it connects to the broader theme of like embracing trick or treat means acknowledging that this is a space for people, right? And acknowledging that it's a space for people and for people to do all sorts of things that they don't normally get to do in the sort of normal course of their everyday lives is what the sort of quote unquote spirit of the holiday is about.
Yes.
And everything that trunk or treat is just like totally ruins that.
Yes.
It's exclusionary. It's kowtowing to the vehicle lobby, right?
Yes. It destroys trust and is indicative of declining trust.
Yeah.
It makes it worse. It makes everything worse.
Yes, and it contributes further to this social atomization that embracing trick-or-treating is just sort of one manifestation of what we are supposed to do in order to solve it, right?
Yep.
So I guess just to bring it back home for everyone here, for this first and hopefully of many bonus episodes, we hope that we have convinced you to reject trunk or treat and embrace trick or treat.
Yep.
But until next time, I'm Clayton Becker.
And I'm Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys next time.